Right, welcome back everybody to this lecture about writing science. This is part 3 and we're going to look at some of the sort of rules that you need to adhere to particularly when you're writing coursework for assessment, but whenever you're writing for us at university. So, just to put this in context, so far I've talked to you about the different types of science that you might read, the different types of science we might ask you to write, and then some hints and tips about how to get the right style, how to format your writing, and how to improve your English. Now we're going to move on to looking at how to write and structure written reports, particularly project write-ups and practical reports that you'll have to do during your time with us. And then we're going to spend a bit of time thinking about references, which are really important. Often, actually, you get almost like marks for free for referencing your work well. And then finally, a little bit about deadlines and other kinds of rules that you might have to adhere to. Okay, so when you write up a piece of practical work, whether it be a short practical in first year or a project in final year, you'll typically be expected to stick to quite a strict formula for your document. You'll typically have 4 main sections: introduction, methods, results, discussion, and you may have some other sections as well. So we're just going to look at what those mean to try to help you structure your document. And notice that some of the things that I'm going to be telling you might be different from the sorts of things you've learned at school. And you're going to have to get used to the scientific way of doing things at university, the sort of style that we typically expect of students and, you know, in our own writing for example, peer-reviewed papers. So the introduction is all about setting the scene. It's pretty obvious, really. You're giving the background to the piece of work that you've done, and you're heading towards expressing what it was that you were trying to achieve with the piece of work that you're writing up. So you can think of this as a sort of inverted triangle type structure for your introduction. You start off with the big ideas, the broad background ideas, and then you're narrowing in on maybe the things that we don't yet know and on the question therefore that you're asking. So we know all this big stuff, but what about this? And okay, so in this paper, in this report, I'm going to be trying to find out this particular question, and that might lead naturally to formulating a hypothesis about what you think is going on in the system about which you're asking a question. Or you might even make a prediction about what you expect to find if you do this piece of work. And then finally, you might also, towards the end of the introduction, mention, roughly speaking, how did you go about addressing this question? How did you go about testing this prediction? So I don't mean giving methodological detail, I mean a sentence or two explaining what sort of study you have done. So we start with a big picture background, often referring to lots of literature. There's this really cool scientific idea, here are the people who've worked on it, it's really cool. Then we go down to say, yeah, but we don't really know this thing, so we're kind of interested in this question. So we did this study of this particular species in this particular situation, testing this particular prediction. So that's the kind of structure you're looking for in an introduction. Then you follow into the methods. So in the methods, your aim is just to tell the reader what you've done. So you are trying to do that in enough detail that somebody else could follow your method and do the same thing, but not with trivial details that everybody would expect to know anyway. And this is the kind of balance you have to strike, because you want to keep the methods pretty succinct. You don't want to tell us really obvious things like, to make some notes in my lab book I used a pencil. You know, that would be trivial detail that you don't need to tell us. But you do need to tell us something, anything really, that was a methodological detail that somebody couldn't obviously guess who hadn't done the work themselves. So you're aiming for somebody, a qualified scientist, to be able to come in, look at your method and then repeat it. Remember, as I've mentioned already, that you're writing in the past tense because this is a method that you have done in order to generate the data you're about to discuss. It's not a set of instructions or a recipe for a future method. So you don't say, step 1, take a Petri dish and pour some agar into it. You say, a Petri dish was filled with agar and the following bacteria were streaked onto it, or whatever. You're talking in the past tense. And in prose, write in continuous prose. Don't write a bullet point list of methods, write normal English text. So that's the methods, actually should be straightforward enough. Results, also pretty straightforward, and the issues really with results, or the problems that we find, are when students try to put more into the results section than they probably really need. The primary aim of the results is to tell us what you found, not to tell us why you found it. Okay, so you just tell us what the data look like, and then leave the discussion for the interpretation to the discussion section of your write-up. So you state the facts. You don't try and say, well, we think we got this result because maybe this other species came in and did this other thing. You don't speculate about that. Leave that to the discussion. You don't say, we got this result and that's really like what Bloggs and Smith got in 2002. Again, that's discussion. So in results, it's just, this was what the pattern was like. And then to support any statements you make in the results about what your results were like, you use figures and tables and stats quite often. And we're going to talk about statistics later on in this course. So whenever you want to use a figure, a graph, or a chart, or a table to support what you're saying, you must refer to it in the text. So you say there was a significant positive correlation between temperature and growth rate, and then you say see figure 1 or see table 1, and then you might also give some statistics to support that. And when you do that, be careful that you don't duplicate information. So if in the figure you've got all of the means for different treatments in your experiment, there's no need to write those means out in the text as well. So this is quite a common fault that we find, that results sections, they feel very short when you've written a results section properly, and you might get a bit anxious about that and try and cram more information into it. But actually, there's no point in taking data out of a table and repeating it in the text. So if it's in the table or in the figures, you don't need to say it in the text, apart from to summarize the overall pattern and then point the reader to the relevant sources of data. So if you're not sure about exactly how to do a results section, a good thing to do is to look at a primary research paper. Even in first year, it doesn't do any harm to have a look at a primary research paper and see how they write a results section, and you'll find that it's very sort of pithy and succinct and short and stating the facts. And then the discussion section is the last major section, and it's where you do that interpretation. So you're trying to explain what you found, and you do that often. A large part of the discussion is putting what you found in the context of what we know from other studies. So you're referencing the literature and saying, well, yes, this pattern that we found is similar to what we would expect from other species or other habitats or other bacterial strains or whatever it might be. And then you give the references. Another thing that you do in the discussion is you discuss the implications of what you found maybe for future research or for society. You know, if you're studying some disease, you might say, well, we found this interesting phenomenon, which might mean that one way of producing therapeutic drugs to attack this disease is such and such. So you make inferences from what you've discovered about possible future developments. So that's what the discussion's for. And it's not for reporting your results. If you find you're having to tell us new results in the discussion, you've probably not completed your results section. It is for that interpretation. But you need to be a bit cautious about how much speculation you do in your results. You don't want to sort of arm wave wildly about all the possible explanations for your results. You need to try to keep it concise and scientific, and ideally justified where possible with literature that's appropriate. Now, a final section, I mean, I talked about this kind of four-part structure to a write-up, but actually there's a kind of fifth really important section that you would almost always have. Right from first year, you need to get into this habit, and that's a references section. It's not a bibliography, which is what you might get in the arts, for example, and you might have been taught at school to write a bibliography, because a bibliography means stuff that you have read in order to be able to write this piece of work. But in the sciences, certainly in the biological sciences, we don't do that. We have a references section which gives the bibliographic data for any sources that are cited in your work. So only if you cite a piece of work do you provide it in the references. And you mustn't have any work that is cited and not referenced, and you mustn't have any work that is referenced and not cited. So it must be completely, they must match up. So what I mean by cited is, I mean you say the structure of DNA is a double helix, Watson and Crick 1953. That Watson and Crick 1953 is a citation in the text of your work, and then at the end, in the references section, you're going to give me the full bibliographic details of Watson and Crick. We're going to come back to this in a minute. And I say here, it's not an afterthought. It seems kind of tedious and boring to prepare your references section, but as you'll find, it's so important that we give you marks for it in a lot of pieces of work. So it's an easy way to get marks by learning the scientific convention of how to present references. It shows that you've done reading. It shows that you haven't made up what you've said in the text, that instead it's rooted in real sources. Okay, so that's the sort of simple structure that we typically expect you to adopt, but you will find in some circumstances you're asked to, or it's appropriate to, provide additional sections. So sometimes you will be told or asked to write an abstract as well, and an abstract is a summary, and it comes at the beginning of your document. It's a short summary of the entire piece of work. So typically it will have a sentence or two explaining the introduction, the kind of background, a sentence or two on the methods used, a sentence or two on the results, and then one or two sentences about what it all means. Sometimes you'll have a separate aims or objectives or hypothesis section somewhere, probably towards the end of the introduction actually, but you might have a kind of headline aim section before the introduction. These are things that I wouldn't recommend you do unless you're specifically asked to do. And you will see some journals, for example, have a style where they like to have a separate section like this. But I would say, if in doubt, only write a straightforward introduction as a single section, unless you're asked to do something different. And then finally, sometimes some people put in a separate conclusion section at the end of the discussion to sort of wrap up and say, okay, what does all this mean for the future? That can be useful, but I would be a bit wary about doing it. First of all, you don't want to subdivide your discussion too much. If it's fairly short anyway, then having a separate section for conclusion is probably unnecessary. It's probably just the last paragraph of your discussion. And the other thing is, there's a tendency to repeat yourself if you feel the need to have a separate conclusion, and it ends up repeating what you've already said in the discussion. So again, if you're asked to do it, do it. But otherwise, I would stick with the things in orange here, the main sections. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about referencing because it's really important. As I say, it gets you marks, and it's also an important part of the scientific process. So I mentioned you need to have citations. So here's at random a paper about penguins, and we've got a statement here. Today, emperor penguins have a circumpolar distribution with suitable habitats spanning the entire continent. And then we've got a reference to Fretwell, a citation saying Fretwell and Trathon, 2009. So this is the citation, and it's telling me that that sentence about the circumpolar distribution of penguins comes from information provided in a source. It didn't come out of the head of the author. In other words, the author is indicating that this is not my idea. This is an idea I've read about. This is established established fact from the scientific literature. And if you want to know more about it, then go and look at this particular paper, Fretwell and Trathon. So that's the style we want you to get into. We want you to, when you make a statement which is about a scientific idea or a fact that isn't of your own creation, you need to tell us where it came from. And initially, when you write an essay in first year, you're probably not going to be using dozens and dozens of sources. You're probably only using a few textbooks and maybe one or two papers. So you may find that you're using the same citation repeatedly, and that's okay, that's absolutely fine. If it's kind of obvious that our block of text comes from the same reference, then you can cite it in the first sentence and you don't need to cite it every sentence thereafter if it's kind of obvious. To go with that citation, then you're going to need a reference at the end of your document. So you'll have this nice, clearly labelled references section. Here's that paper, Fretwell and Trathon. We get full details, full bibliographic details about it. We get the authors, the year in which it was published, the title of the paper, in this case Penguins from Space, Fecal Stains Reveal the Location of Emperor Penguin Colonies, and then the name of the journal, in this case Global Ecology and Biogeography, the volume number and the page numbers. And this is a very standard format that you'll see in almost all journals. There are some that cut some corners and don't put the full details, but this is what we want you to do. The one exception is we want actually even more information than that. We don't want you to abbreviate the journal title if possible. So there are a set of standard abbreviations and many journals use them to save space, but we would ask that you try to give us it in full. So Global Ecology and Biogeography in this case. Think about the formatting of your references section. It should be nice and clearly formatted in alphabetical order. Use indents or spaces. Here we've got indents between, so that the first author stands out really nice and clearly, so that we can run our eye down and find each reference really easily. So think about that when you're presenting them. And you'll see in journals there are various different styles. For example, sometimes the journal title will be italicized, sometimes it won't. Sometimes the volume number will be in bold, sometimes it won't. I don't mind too much. Most people won't mind too much what format you use as long as you're consistent. But particularly for some important pieces of work, it may be stipulated exactly how you should do it, down to the level of whether or not the volume number should be in bold. And if that's the case, you're going to get marks if you can consistently follow that system. And you might be thinking this seems really trivial, but actually it's quite important. It's all about conveying information really clearly so that somebody can have faith in what you've said in your piece of work. And an important bit of advice is not to cite things that you haven't read. So it might be really tempting, especially in first year when you haven't read that much and you haven't got time to read a gazillion papers about penguins before you write your essay about them. But don't be shy of repeating the same citation if necessary, or indeed if you've read about another reference in a secondary reference. You might have read a review, for example, and the review might be talking about a primary paper that you haven't managed to get hold of or that you haven't had time to look at individually. Then you can say that you read about Smith and Bloggs 2005 in Jones 2013. There you can say Smith and Bloggs cited in Jones 2013. Which is exactly what I've got here. So this is a citation where you haven't actually read Smith, you have only read Pratt. And so to make that clear, you would write this as your citation. This is fairly unusual in real scientific writing, because we would expect the person to go away and find the paper. And by the time you get to third year, I certainly wouldn't expect you to do this very often. But maybe in first year, you might need to use this method now and again when you can't get hold of stuff, or you haven't got time to read all of the detail. The reason you write it out like this is because you're telling the reader that you're putting your faith in Pratt, if you like. Pratt is the person whose interpretation of Smith you're going on. And it might be that Pratt's got it wrong, or there might be different ways of interpreting Smith. And so you're letting us know that by citing it like that. So just a word about the sort of standard style of presentation in the references section for different types of publication, because you're going to be reading books and papers and websites, and they each call for slightly different formatting. So this is the kind of classic structure for a paper, and I showed you it on the previous page. We've got the authors, the year, the title of the paper, the title of the journal, often in italics, the volume and the page numbers. So that's the standard structure. Nowadays, some journals don't have volumes and page numbers because they're only online, in which case you might get instead a DOI number, which you'll see if you're looking at a paper that doesn't have a volume and page number, but most of them still do. If you're citing a book, then in the references section, it's this very similar style. You give the author and the date, the year, but now you give the title of the book in italics. So it's the journal or the book that goes in italics normally. Not every journal or not every publication has that style. Sometimes there are no italics. But if you're going to have italics, it'll be the book or the journal title that's in italics. And then for a book, the extra piece of information you give is the publisher and the city in which the publisher was based. So in the case of Darwin's original On the Origin of Species, it's John Murray is the publisher in London. So that's a very specific format that we use. For websites, there's perhaps a bit less agreement about exactly how you present a website, but the golden rule really is don't use websites if you can avoid it, because they tend to be, as we've already seen, potentially unreliable in terms of the scientific evidence that's used there. Potentially also unstable. You look at a website and then you come back to it a few weeks later and it's disappeared and you just get an error. And variable in their presentation. So there are lots of reasons why websites are not great. Please try where you can to find papers and textbooks as your original sources rather than websites. But sometimes you want to cite a website, and that's perfectly legitimate, and it's better to cite it than just to pretend that it came out of thin air. So if you're going to do that, you need to give us as much information as possible so that we stand, or the reader stands, the best chance of finding this source in the future. So give the author, if possible, not always possible, sometimes it's anonymous. Give the date wherever it's possible, the title, the full URL of the website, the date you accessed it, and any sort of publishing organisation or professional organisation associated with the work. So for my Badger Call article, I've got the name of the author, the year, the title of the article, the full URL of the BBC website, the fact that it came from the BBC as the organisation, and then the date I accessed it. Okay, so sometimes some of that information will have to go missing, which is one of the reasons why websites are not very useful references, but you do as best you can in the circumstances. Okay, I want to finish by a few other things you need to think about when you're submitting work. So one of the things is you'll often get asked to make your essay or your practical write-up look like a scientific paper. And this is really quite confusing, because what we don't necessarily mean is make it look like a paper that you would see online or in the library. Because when you look at a paper as it finally ends up in a journal, like this one here, this is actually a Nature paper, so it's a very high profile journal, you will find that they tend to do everything they possibly can to save space. So they'll cram the text up into columns, they will use very small font sizes, they will use numerical references instead of giving a proper citation. Instead of saying Smith and Blogs, they just put the number 1. And these are all things that we would advise against unless you're specifically told to do it. Don't use columns of text, use the full width of the page for your text, and don't use numerical references unless you're asked to. And things get worse when we look at figures. Okay, so in papers, when they're trying to save space in real journals, they'll often cram the figures into the corner of the page, make them very small and hard to read. We would ask that you don't do that unless you're specifically told to do it. Make the figures nice and big, use the full width of the page, put the figure below the paragraph of text in which they're first mentioned. So do that, and then we stand the best chance of being able to understand your figure, your graph, whatever it might be. Last little word is about the rules. So when you do a piece of coursework, you'll typically see that there are some rules. As a minimum, there's normally a deadline and probably a word limit. So in the School of Life Sciences, a word limit is a limit, not a target. So you will find that you might have mates in halls or friends doing other courses where they have actually a target. You know, you need to write a 2,000 word essay plus or minus 10% or something. That's quite common in the arts. In the sciences, particularly in life sciences, it's a hard limit. We're saying do not write more than this. So if it says 2,000 words, you don't write more than 2,000 words. If you go over 2,000 words, then you're likely to get penalised. And there's a typical penalty of 5% for every 10% or part thereof that you go over. So if it's a 2,000 word essay and you write 2,020 words, that risks a 5% penalty, 5% reduction in your mark. So please don't do that. It's a really easy way to lose marks unnecessarily. There's always a way of being more concise, of shortening your document. And you might think, no, this is all very artificial. Why are you making us jump through these hoops? Actually, it's exactly the same for us. When we submit a paper, there'll be a hard word limit and they'll just send it back or reject it out of hand if it's too long. When we submit a grant application for research funding, the same will apply. And believe me, I know examples where literally millions of pounds have gone down the tube because people haven't used the right font or they've gone over the word limit. So it's an unfortunate fact of scientific life that you'll have word limits. The deadlines, similarly, there is a penalty obviously for going over your deadline. If you don't submit the work on time, you will be penalised 5% of your mark per working day after the deadline. So if the deadline's 3 p.m. on a Thursday and you submit it at 4 p.m. on a Thursday or 3:05 p.m. on a Thursday, you're going to lose 5%. If it's 4 p.m. on the Friday, then you're going to lose 10%. The weekend at the moment doesn't count as working days, and so if you had a deadline on a Friday, actually, you know, the fact that you submitted it on Sunday night would still only incur a 5% penalty. The university are talking about changing that rule, but they haven't done yet. There may be a very good reason why you've not met a deadline. it may be that you have what we call extenuating circumstances. You might be ill, you might have had a family problem that you couldn't have anticipated, in which case you need to let us know. Don't suffer in silence, don't take the hit of the penalty when in fact there was nothing you could do about it. You tell us through the extenuating circumstances system. So you can go online to the Student Services webpage, you can tell us about your ECs, it gets abbreviated to EC, extenuating circumstance, provide some evidence, and then if appropriate, extensions can be applied. But you won't get an extension if you are just a bit late because you forgot about it, and you won't get an extension if you don't tell us about extenuating circumstances before the deadline. The only exception to that is if you can't tell us because you're incapacitated in some way. So if you're in hospital in a coma, obviously you can't tell us about your extenuating circumstances until you get well enough to do it, and that might be after the deadline. But in most cases, if you've got the flu, you can drop an email to your module convener saying, I've got the flu, I can't submit my work, I'm going to need to apply for extenuating circumstances before the deadline. Okay, so that's the end of this lecture about writing science. If you want some more useful tips about how to write science, particularly in a university context, here's some suggested reading. I don't suggest you all go out and read all of these in great detail. It's more if you think that this is an area that you'd like to improve or where you're struggling. These are some books that you can use for further support, as well as the resources that Caroline's provided. And Caroline is a good person to talk to if you really do find that maybe when you're getting some work back and you're getting your marks are not as good as you'd hoped, and you feel like that it's your writing that's holding you back, please do drop Caroline a line and ask to have a chat to her about how you could get some resources to improve. Okay, that's the end of this session. Thanks. Oh, one more reading. Sorry, I forgot about that. There's another paper there. This is actually a scientific paper in something called the Bulletin of the Ecological Society of America. So it's very short. It's only a few pages long. And it's kind of aimed at undergraduates. It's written by an ecologist like me, so I'm always a bit biased in favour of ecology, but this is relevant whether you be a neuroscientist or a biochemist or a geneticist. It's a step-by-step guide to writing well for undergraduates, and if you're looking for a kind of succinct, quick start guide, I would recommend that. And that's me done.